Now, since the passing of the bill to establish the Nigerian Coast Guard scaled second reading in the Senate, Nigerians have been critical of a move to duplicate the responsibilities of the Nigerian Navy, saddled with coastal protection of the country's waterways. An idea they say might be an unnecessary complication. Sponsored by Senator Wasiu Eshilokun, APC Lagos, the bill sought to establish the Nigerian Coast Guard to be charged with the responsibility of securing maritime zones within Nigeria. He said the bill was also aimed at maintaining a state of readiness as a specialized service in support of the Nigerian Navy in war situations. According to Senator Eshilokun, the overriding intent of the bill is to enact legislation that will seek to contribute to the country's security with a special focus on the country's maritime interests and regional coastal security. As the hearing originally scheduled for today is postponed, we're now joined by retired Vice Admiral Dele Joseph Ezeoba, a former chief of the Naval Staff, and Usoro, pioneer Director General, Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NMASA. Good morning to you and a warm welcome to the morning show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good morning, Admiral.
Good morning, and thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you for joining us. Well, this is not the first time the Coast Guard bill will be on the table. The other time, the federal government found a way of killing it, so to speak. But now, Admiral, is back on the table now. And the concern is that this will be a duplication of responsibilities of the Navy, of the Army, and I think we also have these private contractors who are monitoring our waterways. But some people say that, well, this will strengthen the Navy, that the Navy needs support, that the Gulf of Guinea is particularly very dangerous. There is terrorism, there is illegal fishing, and that the more the merrier. Well, as an admiral, do you think that this will pose a threat to the Navy? And Mrs. Usoro, thank you for joining us from London. Do you see any merit this time around in having a Coast Guard? You were in charge of NMASA at the time. So is it that existing platforms are inefficient and they need to be boosted up by having a Coast Guard bill? Or do you consider it additional bureaucracy that may not be necessary? Let's start with you in the studio, Admiral.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Rufai.
Morning, sir.
Before I proceed with this all-important discourse, please, I crave your indulgence to join all well-meaning Nigerians to express my condolences to the family of the departed Chief of Army Staff, General Lagbaja. I pray that the God Almighty will grant his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed eternal rest in his bosoms. Amen. And then, of course, strengthen the family. Amen. And grant them the fortitude to bear the loss. That said, it is important in the circumstance as we speak today to define certain parameters when we tend to inform or formulate policy as a country. The Coast Guard bill has been presented today in the Senate. To my mind, is fraught with a lot of errors. My discourse on this subject will be premised on three fundamental principles. The first will be to question the intent of the bill, and that I will do by addressing the statement of the problem. The second one will be on the implications of the said bill, and then I will conclude with recommendations on the way forward. I like to say that as a fundamental requirement to formulate policy, there must be certain fundamental parameters that must be taken into consideration. And one of such is to do a gap analysis, because policies are supposed to address specific challenges and problems. In the context of this bill as it is, I doubt if a proper gap analysis was done to identify fault lines, and then, of course, try to enunciate policy that will address those fault lines. Because at the end of the day, you must ensure you have a policy strategy match to ensure that the tangible outcomes so perceived to be addressed by that bill can be measured in tangible terms. Now, the bill, in part, if you take part 1, Articles 2 A to I of the bill, which clearly enunciates the responsibilities and duties of the Coast Guard as it would be if established. A clear duplication of the functions of the Nigerian Navy as we speak today under their policing functions, as clearly stated in Armed Forces Cap 20, which is an amplification of 217, Section 217 of the Nigerian Constitution, which in its wisdom created the armed forces and did elucidate what their responsibilities will be. So in the circumstance as it is today, it is completely out of reality and out of sync to think that the Coast Guard, with the same responsibilities and functions of the Nigerian Navy as extant as it is today, will solve the problem. By way of implication, what it will rather do is to compound the existing challenges that the members of the armed forces that operate in this theater are already experiencing. The Navy, as it is, have performed excellently well in the past to discharge these functions, which encapsulates their basic policing functions, which the Coast Guard intended to be established, have been saddled with in the circumstance. So what do you see? What it implies is complete anarchy in the maritime space, because you are saying that the Coast Guard will operate within the entire maritime zones of the country. And this is the same maritime zones that the Nigerian Navy and, of course, the Air Force, in close support with air surveillance, is already operating in. Secondly, there's going to be serious conflict of interest and lack of trust. And that will create further challenge for the optional and optimal delivery in terms of what the mandate of the various services are. The other area will be the area of lack of trust. And there will be lack of cohesion and coordination because every entity, as it were, in that space will be competing to secure and make themselves more relevant.
Okay, Admiral,
Yes.
let's go straight to Mrs. Usoro,
Yes.
who is with us in London. Well, Madam, do you agree with the Admiral that this will create lack of cohesion, anarchy, lack of trust, confusion within the maritime sector?
Thank you very much, Dr. Abati. And indeed, it will add to the duplication of roles, which is something that we have been complaining about. But what bothers me most, Ruben, is the process. Section 1 of the bill is very clear that they seek to establish a Coast Guard as a military service and a branch of the armed forces of Nigeria. How is a branch of the armed forces established in our country? Is it a person, an individual? Can it be through a private member's bill? What is the process? Because I think that that bill shouldn't even have been on the floor of the National Assembly, even from first reading, let alone second, and then going on. Because it accentuates the lack of coordinated, cohesive policy-making process. If a branch of the armed forces is to be set up, who makes that decision? And who should push the legislative process? From my thinking, though I was born to see the armed forces that we have, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and they are in the Constitution, surely it ought to have been a discussion among the armed forces themselves and all the security organs of the federal government of Nigeria to see whether there is an urgency or a good case has been made for the establishment of another branch of the armed forces. And then it will go to FEC, and it will be approved by FEC, and then it should be by executive order. So, you see, we shouldn't abuse the process. So I don't think, ab initio, that bill should go anywhere. But of course, the Admiral is very correct. It adds to duplicity. There are some parts of the bill that says this Coast Guard will be responsible for training of seafarers, which by the Merchant Shipping Act and the NIMASA Act is clearly the job of a Maritime Safety Agency. There's another portion that says it will be involved in oceanography, fisheries, and hydrography. We have the Hydrographic Agency, and from time immemorial, the Navy has been responsible for hydrography. In fact, we also have the Navy domiciled in NIMASA, the hydrographic officers domiciled in NIMASA. But Ruben, let me just remind you, and some of my colleagues that are watching, when I was the DG of NIMASA, part of the Maritime Safety Administration's job is search and rescue. And having to board ships at sea is not something that ordinary civilians can easily do without the backup of the Navy. So what I did myself with the then CNS was to agree to have a detachment of law enforcement to come in and be domiciled in NIMASA. So we formed the Maritime Guard Command so that they can assist NIMASA to perform that portion of their duties that requires enforcement at sea. It was a good collaboration, and it still is, because they have not even gone beyond what we thought of to go into the areas, collaborative efforts on maritime security. Let me not take up much of your time, but I will answer other specific questions, Ruben.
All right, thank you so much for that. I'll bring the conversation back to the studio, sir. And so the foundational issue is clear, which is that there's a room for more to be done. For example, if you look at the issue of illegal fishing, it's costing the nation almost 35 billion naira annually. So there's an intervention that is required. So if it's not in the form of this Coast Guard bill, then what is what are you prescribing is the solution to support the efforts that are ongoing by the Navy and the various agencies that are engaged in maritime services?
The point here is that of strengthening the existing structures. The Nigerian Navy, as I speak, has over the years discharged these fundamental functions under the policing role: anti-fishery, anti-piracy, search and rescue, and a host of the policing functions as it is. The illegal fishing and underreported fishing is part of the policing functions that the Navy has done. We've arrested fishing trawlers, we have enforced fishing regulations and all that, and we have done excellently well in these areas. It is not a fundamental function of lack of the capacity or capability. It is the lack of adequate structure in terms of providing the necessary, platforms that will ensure that the Navy saturates the operating environment and enforce the laws by arresting the bad guys. That is what is important. What we should be talking about now is to consolidate on what we have as a Navy, as a country, rather than creating parallel institutions that will dissipate energy and resources in the wrong directions. Because if we do not, as a matter of policy, provide strengthened ministries, departments, and agencies of government that have been inundated constitutionally to discharge these functions, in which case we'll be able to save enough resources to provide the enablers that they need so that they can perform optimally and ensure the success of the job for which they have been taxed. So creating parallel institutions mean dissipating resources. And I know that as a country today, we do not have that resource base to create parallel institutions that will ultimately disadvantage existing institutions and will not achieve the goal for which those institutions have been established. So, whether we like it or not, it is a matter of fact that we must continue to redefine the priorities of government and ensure that we put structures that will support what we already have. I recall not too long ago, this same government, decided to implement the Orational report, which is to streamline government functions and make them more robust and more efficient. In the same token, somebody in the Senate is trying to create or promulgate a bill that will create a parallel institution, a branch of the armed forces, just like Mrs. Usoro did say. That should be an executive function and not a private bill. Because it is only the state, on the strength of the executive, that will sit down and determine, based on threat analysis, whether we should create an additional arm of the armed forces, not an individual. It's beyond his scope of competence and understanding. And these are the things we talk about when we look at the legal instruments that define the protocol of policy. So for me, it is an exercise in futility. What we should be focusing on today is how do we strengthen the existing institutions, do what we can to add value by making sure we give them the enablers that will help them to achieve the set goals and objectives for which they have been set up. In the circumstance as it is today, I know, for whatever it is worth, that the services are not adequately funded, both in terms of human and material resource. Okay? So if you create a new institution, as is being propagated, you're going to be dissipating resources. So in other words, at the end of the day, the various services will be, cap in hand, begging to see if they can even discharge their functions. So for me, it is a new thinking that this bill should be set aside, stepped down, so that we can focus on the next plank of action.
Okay. Real quickly, I got a couple of people say they were watching Dr. Ezeoba sends his regards, and a couple of other people. Real quickly, but I also want to talk about other very pertinent matters, because it's not today you've been having this talk about Coast Guard. They've been Absolutely. If my memory serves me right, where I've read in places that it goes back even to the 70s, that this talk about Coast Guard. But I want you to talk about, and I don't see it more, the duplicity of duties. Today, as it is, even with those private contractors, we've seen clashes with the Navy.
Correct.
So when you now add the Coast Guard to it, is it not going to be triple? We've seen days that Tantita will come here and openly disagree and fight with the Navy and say the Navy is lying and all of that. True. But I'm sorry, Lord, let me come to you as regards this duplicity, this fight, and you can also answer it when I come back to you. Are we not just going to have more fights and more infighting and more, lack of camaraderie or concord among these many multiple layers on our coastal waters, and it's going to even bring about less performance? What do you think about that, ma'am?
Do I come in there?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Of course, there would be duplicity. Already, the Navy, the Armed Forces Act is very, very clear. It enumerates the duty of the Navy. Apart from the diplomatic, the military, you have anti-bunkering and also fisheries and supporting the implementation of international conventions. So in this bill, fisheries is also mentioned as part of the duties of the Coast Guard. There will be duplication and there will be confusion, there will be infighting, and that is where we should focus on the optimal utilization of resources. Is setting up a separate agency at this time the best way to go? Or should we encourage the structure in the Navy to have a dedicated command for Coast Guard? Because talking about international best practice, I've heard people say there have to be a Coast Guard because that's international best practice. I'm sorry. There are several formats. There are several models by different countries, and whichever works for them. Majority of countries have the Navy perform those roles, multiple roles, military, diplomatic, and maritime security, maritime safety. But I've also heard the example of the IMO. IMO does not dictate to countries who should do what. In the case of Nigeria, the Ministry of Marine and Blue Economy is the focal point for the IMO. And the MASA is the designated agency. It does not state anywhere that there must be a Coast Guard. Some countries have Coast Guard, they have Navy, and they have Maritime Safety Administration. So you have the Navy doing the military, and you have the Coast Guard performing the post-state control functions and search and rescue, hot pursuit, and then you have Maritime Administration that does flag state duties. That is about ship registry and growing indigenous ship registration. That works for some countries. Majority of countries, in order to optimally utilize limited resources, have the Navy doing this in collaboration with civilian outfits. So this bill, it's really not well thought of, because how will the marshal, the head of the Coast Guard, who is supposed to be a serving naval officer, report to a civilian ministry? What happens to the command and control where his primary employment is, which is the Nigerian Navy? There are lots of things technically that are not clear. A serious bill like this should be accompanied by a cost compendium, so that we talk with figures on what it will cost to set up a Coast Guard agency, and see whether those that same amount, if we can afford it, cannot be better utilized to strengthen what we have, the arrangement that we have currently on ground. And I also don't see the repeal provisions in the copy that I have. So, Ruben, is going to cause confusion. And that is what stakeholders have been worried about, where there is no coordinated implementation, or even right from the policy making, enforcement and implementation, everybody is fighting for turf. We saw it, sometimes it's been taken to court, like the Newa Lagos State matter. This is what will also happen if it goes. And I really don't think it should be stepped down, because it flies in the face of really, process for setting up a branch of the armed forces.
I want to ask you before I come, even the role of those private people like Tantita, is it not duplicitous already? The role of those private people, because we can see the head butting private security contractors that they have boats on the water. Is it not duplicitous? Is that one not duplicitous already?
Private maritime security.
Yeah.
Yes, private maritime security agencies, they are actually employed by ship owners to secure their vessels.
No, they are the ones employed by the government I'm talking about. The likes of
various waters.
The likes of Tantitas of this world, the ones employed by government. That's the one I'm talking about. The government is paying heavy money to every year.
As an NPC.
An NMPC, beg your pardon.
Yes, yeah. that is duplicitous.
Yeah.
And we are spending money to engage those ones. So why can the Navy not do it? The Navy has to be the ones to be consulted, so that we see whether they have capacity. Let a decision be made that the Navy does not have the capacity, first of all. And that decision has to be made at the level of security agencies or security organs and the other branches of the armed forces before something else is done. Yes, there is duplication, and money is funds are being used to do several things at the same time.
Thank you so much. Coming back to you on that, because you see, we've had those private security guys even make us ask very due questions about the even integrity of the Navy. I have been on this table when we've seen the fight and stew between Tantita and the Navy, even accusing the Navy of doing bunkering or of supporting those that are stealing our crude and national assets.
That's right. Okay, Rufai, let's be clear here. You see, when you create a monster, then you must deal with these consequences. Whatever choices we make have consequences. The issue of the private security operators within the maritime space was out of, let's be clear here, out of necessity, to some extent. To some extent. What happened, because I feel I have the opportunity to have been one of those who took decisions at the time. The oil majors, when we had serious challenges in the Niger Delta, did demand that the Navy should pre-position platforms 247, 365 to protect their assets. And the Navy, we had very limited of such resources. So we couldn't do that. And we sat with them and they said, listen, the only way they can continue to operate to provide the needed resources to make sure that we oil the country was for such security structure to be in place in their operating environments. And we said, if that be the case, buy us platforms so we can commit resources in terms of men and material to protect those assets, 247, 365. But they came up with the clause that under the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, does not allow the oil companies to buy military assets for sovereign states. So, which is the way out. So they went and discussed at the highest echelon of this, policy making, and decided that what could be possible was to engage private security companies that would provide these assets. That is, what they did was to outsource the procurement of the assets to civilian contractors, who in turn bought the assets and came to the Navy and established an MOU under a protocol to partner with the Navy so that the Navy will subsequently provide those personnel that will man those vessels to provide that security dedicated to their platforms. That was the genesis of these private security entities in our maritime space. Okay, at the time, Mr. Ruben, just wait a minute. At the time this was enunciated, it was seamless because it was only the Navy that was providing that dedicated security with the platforms outsourced to third parties, which were brought and ceded to the Navy. Painted in Navy colors, assigned Navy call signs, and manned 100% by naval personnel. But of course, they remain in the maritime operating area of those companies that provided the resource to buy those vessels. So in other words, we do not lack human capacity or expertise. What we lack to saturate and dominate our maritime space is the resource, the vessels that will provide those seamless operational requirements. The sea is a vast area of space. You cannot walk on the water. Only one person walked, Jesus Christ.
Okay, Admiral.
So if we have to do what is required, we must continue to consolidate on what is existing and not creating parallel institutions. That is the bane of this
Admiral,
contention.
You know what I sense here?
Yes.
I sense territoriality. Now, this is our space. We don't want other people to come there. Now, the same Nigerian Navy that you say has human capacity has been criticized as a collection of uniformed pirates. It may sound harsh, but that's what people have said. And that the Nigerian Navy is just doing coastal Navy work, whereas what is good for Nigeria will be a blue water Navy, like they have in the United States. In other words, would the Coastal Guard help to deepen that capacity? Isn't there a need for reform, even as we talk about, territoriality and all of that? Now, to go to Mrs. Usoro. Mrs. Usoro, now we always talk about international best practices, and we always like to emulate what they do in the United States. I get the point about duplication of functions, overlapping functions, and the chaos that Admiral talked about. But if they have a Coastal Guard in U.S. Coast Guard in America, wouldn't it also be a good idea here? Perhaps if we have the Coast Guard, we may not, have the issues we're having with managing the marine economy or blue economy that this administration says is focusing upon. Well, let me start with General first. Let him...
No, Admiral, please.
Sir?
Admiral, please.
Admiral.
Yes,
Admiral.
There's a big difference between General and Admiral.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay, Ruben,
Yes, sir.
please, I'd like to address the issue you raised that has to do with what is it? What did you say?
Territoriality.
Very good. It is absolute buncon. With all sense of humility and responsibility. The Navy, as we speak today, you alluded to a blue sea Navy. No. The Nigerian Navy has a tripartite policy structure in terms of strategy. We have the military, the diplomatic, and the policing function. The military function is for wartime emphasis. The diplomatic function is when we have the need for gunboat diplomacy. All right? And then the policing function is Coast Guard duties, Ruben, in its entirety. And I said to you before that the responsibilities captured in Part 1, 2A to I of the proposed bill are fundamental functions of the Nigerian Navy in entirety, as captured in Armed Forces Act, Cap 20, an amplification of 217 of the Constitution. So what are we talking about? Aside from that, there is the Marine Police also that has been, structured and mandated to also operate in the backwaters and within the territorial waters. There is Nigerian Customs, the Marine section. The Navy has collaborated with all of these entities in the past to ensure that we provide the necessary infrastructure to secure the space. We have not been found one thing. Recently, on the effort of the Navy, the Nigerian maritime space was delisted by the International Maritime Bureau from the piracy index list. Things are happening. So we must, as a matter of urgency, try as much as possible to consolidate on the gains recorded so far. Provide the enablers that will help these institutions that have been so established to pursue and deliver on their mandates. What I want to say moving forward, by way of what we should do, institutional memory tells me that in the past, people have advocated for these Coast Guard issues. But of course, we advocated and advanced arguments why it wasn't necessary. And they allowed superior argument to prevail, and it was stepped down. So this won't be the first time it's going to happen. Okay, so what I'm going to advise, Ruben, don't cut me short here, it's very important. What I'm going to advise is this. We must, as a matter of priority, do what is needed. What needs to be done now is that this bill should be stepped down. Government, in its wisdom, should do a security sector reform.
Okay.
All right? Security sector reform will interrogate our existing capacities and capabilities, and then, of course, provide a model that will allow for proper integration of extant assets.
Okay, fair point.
Entrenched with the military.
Let's
so that we can make progress and provide for what is required, rather than creating unnecessary duplication that will create more problems.
Mrs. Usoro, very quickly.
Do I come in there? Yes, thank you very much. So talking about international best practice, that we have Coast Guard in the US, and why shouldn't we have in Nigeria? I would say it works okay for the US, but why don't we come nearer home to Africa to see what obtains in other countries? At least one of the countries that we use in trying to benchmark is South Africa. They don't have a Coast Guard. It is the Navy that is combining the military function and also the maritime security, search and rescue, Coast Guard functions. It's a Navy. They have strengthened their Navy. They have awarded sufficient attention in funding to the Navy in South Africa. I think in talking about all the coastal countries in Africa, maybe just about 5 countries have Coast Guards. The others are smaller countries.
And they don't have navies.
The majority of countries in Africa and indeed the world, those functions are performed by the Nigerian Navy, by their navies. But the point you make, sir, which I appreciate, and also from the civilian point of view, the perception has been created that Nigerian Navy does not have sufficient funds to execute its task. It's not a very nice thing that the Navy is eager to go, but they do not have funding. So perhaps our government should focus on providing what is necessary in terms of funding, so that they don't look up to civilians to purchase platforms. So if that is done, and they still don't do what they are supposed to do, like in the fisheries, the illegal, unreported, unregulated fisheries, let's see how far they go in the deep sea with the required assets and platforms, if they will not be able to curb it to a reasonable standard, then we can say, okay, there is a gap. Let's have a scientific study to prove whether there is a gap. A good case be made that the Nigerian Navy has failed, given all the resources that has been allocated to them that failed, and then we can look for a solution. But we are not there yet.
On that note, we would like to thank you very much, Mrs. Usoro and Admiral Ezeoba with us here in the studio. Thank you very much indeed.